I'm actually going to start with the Scottish influence on the Irish revival, then look at Ireland in the Scottish revival with a focus on Hugh McDermid. So I've tweaked the title a little bit. Okay, I think the major connections and tensions between Irish and Scottish literatures in the modern period begin with the publication of Macpherson's Ossian in the 1760s. I would suggest that Irish authors and scholars were simultaneously irritated by Macpherson's activities and creatively stimulated by them. Furthermore, the scholarly activity that arose in the years following Macpherson's Ossian laid some of the foundations for the Irish revival of the late 19th/early 20th century. For example, the setting up of the Ossianic Society of Dublin in 1853. While Ossian was a significant influence on representations of the Celtic nature of Ireland, or parts of Ireland, it was also the target of pointed criticism in works such as Sidney Owenson's national tale, The Wild Irish Girl from 1806. Toward the end of the 19th century, Ossian was ignored in W.B. Yeats's The Wanderings of Ossian, despite Yeats working within an Ossianic discourse set up by Macpherson and mid-19th century theorists of Celtic literature, such as Matthew Arnold, in texts such as On the Study of Celtic Literature from 1867. The Wild Irish Girl and The Wanderings of Ossian are part of a wide or broader Irish response, including a wave of hostility from 18th century scholars and antiquarians, such as Charles O'Connor and Sylvester O'Halloran, to texts that had claimed Scotland as the original Celtic nation and the real home of the Fenian ballads. Connections and tensions between Irish and Scottish Celticists continued into the era of the Celtic revivals. For example, the Scottish author Fiona MacLeod was initially involved in Yeats and Augusta Gregory's Celtic theatre. Indeed, the theatre was named the Celtic Theatre rather than the Irish Theatre in order to include MacLeod. The theatre was also to produce plays written by MacLeod. In a letter to Fiona from January 1897, Yeats wrote that our Irish literary and politico-literary organizations are pretty complete now. Celtic plays would be far more effective than lectures and might do more than anything else we can do to make the Irish, Scotch, and other Celts recognize their solidarity. However, the Celtic theatre eventually became the Irish Literary Theatre, and they never produced any of MacLeod's plays. Fiona MacLeod was supposedly, I'm sure many of you know this, to quote Mark Williams, a self-sequestered Hebridean visionary. A great deal of work was produced under the name Fiona MacLeod in the 1890s and 1900s, with a number of MacLeod texts appearing in the Evergreen, the influential Edinburgh Celticist journal. In reality, Fiona MacLeod was, to quote Mark Williams again, the contrasexual authorial persona of the Scotsman William Sharp. This secret was not officially revealed until Sharp's death in 1905, although Yeats and George Russell, or A.E., had their suspicions much earlier. Sharp visited Ireland in 1897 and met Gregory at Tillira Castle in Galway, the home of Edward Martin. Discussing MacLeod and the Celtic theatre, Augusta Gregory commented that, I think the word Celtic was put in for the sake of Fiona MacLeod, whose plays, however, we never acted, though we used to amuse ourselves by thinking of the call for author that might follow one and the possible appearance of William Sharp in place of the beautiful woman he had given her out to be, for even then we had little doubt they were one and the same person. I myself never quite understood the meaning of the Celtic movement, which we were said to belong to. When I was asked about it, I used to say it was a movement meant to persuade the Scotch to begin buying our books while we continued not to buy theirs. The comment regarding the movement's supposed aversion to buying Scotch books is interesting, given the influence of work by figures such as James Macpherson, Walter Scott, Thomas Carlyle, Alexander Carmichael, and James Fraser on the Irish revival, as well as the contributions of Fiona MacLeod to the Celtic movement. George Watson has noted that, quote, Carlyle's ideas permeated much that Yeats read and heard because they were mediated in the work of Carlyle's enthusiastic Irish discipline, Standish James O'Grady, whom Yeats and others saw as the father of the revival, end quote. According to Yeats, but for the legend and history of the Highlanders, who are in all things of one stock with ourselves, Walter Scott could hardly have begun that great modern medieval movement, which has influenced all the literature and art and much of the religion of the 19th century. Until our day, the Celt has dreamed half the dreams of Europe. Also, John Butler Yeats read Scott's The Lay of the Last Minstrel and Ivanhoe to Yeats when he was a boy. However, Yeats rarely discusses Scottish matters, with the notable exception of his analysis of Scottish folklore in an article, brilliantly titled article, called A Remonstrance with Scotsmen for Having Soured the Disposition of Their Ghosts and Fairies. That's from 1893. And I think Yeats was much less interested in Scotland than Joyce, for example. In the Irish revival as a whole, Scotland is either part of the world of ancient sagas and Celtic wonder, as it is in the work of Ella Young, for example, or is a distinctly un-Celtic space and the root cause of the supposedly un-Irish nature of the north of Ireland, as it is in the work of Catherine Tynan, for example. The tension between Gregory and Sharp was exacerbated by political differences. Daniel G. Williams has commented that, quote, Sharp's Celticism was deeply anti-nationalist. I think that's certainly true if the nation in question is Scotland. However, Sharp displays a great admiration for English culture in his work, and he was a nationalist of a sort, British unionism having the traits of nationalism, but with a focus on a multi-nation state rather than a nation, in contrast to Gregory's gradual development from unionism to Irish nationalism. This contrast reflects a larger division between the Irish and Scottish Celtic revivals. As Silkestro has commented, quote, in Scotland, the Celtic Renaissance was considerably less radical than its Irish counterpart, both linguistically and politically, end quote. However, I would say that Celticism combines with radical politics in Scotland in the 20th century. It might be said that while Gregory and MacLeod were both Celtic revival writers, for Gregory, the movement was not really Celtic, at least not in an international or pan-Celtic sense. It was specifically Irish. And for MacLeod, it was not really a revival, at least not politically. According to Elizabeth Sharp, FM, so Fiona MacLeod, deplored the uniting of the political element to the movement. Furthermore, the decline of Gaelic Scotland is a key theme in MacLeod/Sharp's work, not its resurrection. Okay, now I'll move on to the subject of Irish culture in the Scottish revival by focusing on Hugh MacDiarmid's Hibernophilia. MacDiarmid followed Irish politics and culture closely and visited Ireland twice in 1928 and 1978. MacDiarmid saw Ireland's struggle for independence as a potential source of instruction and inspiration for Scotland. He said, I believe that Ireland, during its long struggle, not only set a magnificent example of following the gleam, but that it had a prescience of the wider implications of the necessity of doing so. In short, that the true interpretation of its achievement was a deep intuition of the ruination a continued English ascendancy was enforcing on these islands. MacDiarmid's admiration for modern Ireland covered both politicians and cultural figures. Writing in 1928, MacDiarmid praised Ireland as having, quote, produced an astonishingly rich and varied crop of men and women during the past 50 to 70 years. A brilliant and restless generation. Think of these people: Yeats, A.E., George Russell, George Moore, J.M. Synge, Lady Gregory, Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith, James Connolly, Lord Dunsany, Maud Gonne, Eamon de Valera. He also claimed that on one of his visits to Ireland, he had urinated in a Dublin alleyway together with Yeats after a heavy night on the lemonade at George Russell's house. He said, I crossed swords with him and I had the better flow. This poetic, sorry, that was the best I could do for MacDiarmid's impression. This poetic pissing contest, with its echoes of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus in the garden of 7 Eccles Street, may be one of MacDiarmid's tall tales. However, it does reveal MacDiarmid's desire to be aligned with figures from Irish culture and politics. Even the nom de plume or nom de guerre MacDiarmid, as Scott Lyell has pointed out, echoes the name of the Easter Rising leader, Sean MacDiarmid. It is also probable that Hugh MacDiarmid was chosen as it has more of an obvious Celtic or Scottish ring and look to it than Christopher Murray Grieve, So a sort of nominative Celticism the poet has in common with Fiona MacLeod. MacDiarmid welcomed Irish immigration into Scotland at a time when anti-Irish sentiment was rife in sections of Scottish society. For MacDiarmid, Scottish anti-Irishness was, quote, a profound mistake. Partly this was because MacDiarmid saw Irish migration into Scotland as maintaining what he saw as the ancient Gaelic Commonwealth. MacDiarmid also imagined establishing a Celtic union in socialist Soviet republics. As has been noted by John Brannigan and Scott Lyell, of all the modern writers of the Atlantic archipelago, with the possible exception of Yeats, MacDiarmid is the figure most interested and invested in the concept of the Celtic world and of a Celtic revival. MacDiarmid's Gaelic Commonwealth, or the idea of a modern, united and resurgent Celtic front, is first expressed artistically in his book-length poem To Circumjax and Crastus, published in 1930. The Circumjax and Crastus envisages Gaeldom regained, a utopian space in which, quote, the Gaelic sun swings up again. In a 1927 article, MacDiarmid proposed a renewal of Gaelic culture in order to, quote, repair the fatal breach in continuity which has cut us off from our own roots. For MacDiarmid, modernity had brought about a need to return to origins. He writes elsewhere that, quote, civilization needs to renew itself at its original sources. In MacDiarmid's vision, this repair work will be achieved partly through Irish immigration into Scotland, something that will reverse the harm done to Gaelic Scotland over the centuries, and through an influx of Catholicism, work to undo the damage done by the Protestant Reformation. This injection of Catholic/Celtic spirit will presumably also help to reverse the Anglicization of Scotland, since, quote, the great poets of Gaelic Ireland were able to soar up frae the rags and tatters of the muckle grey mist o' Englishry. In St. Crastus, the idea of Celtic regeneration is expressed in arboreal terms. He says, the forests of Alba cut down now that may grow again, thanks to the branch of Ireland growing among us. In Memoriam James Joyce, A Vision of World Language from 1955, the increased interest in the Gaelic or Celtic world first developed in St. Crastus converges with the development of MacDiarmid's so-called poetry of fact from the second half of the 1930s onwards. In addition, Joyce's death in 1941 gave MacDiarmid the opportunity to add further Celtic elements to the text through its dedication through a number of moments in which he addresses the departed Irishman. The work, complete with illustrations by John Duncan Ferguson based on Ogham, the early Irish system of writing, is a central text of MacDiarmid's modernist Celticism. MacDiarmid began work on what was to become In Memoriam James Joyce in the 1930s, i.e. before Joyce's death, but it was not completed and published until the mid-50s. Similarly to the personal links between the Irish and Scottish Celtic revivals, MacDiarmid had a number of contacts in Ireland, and as I mentioned earlier, he visited the country in 1928 and again in 78. However, Joyce was, of course, long gone from Ireland in 1928, and the two never met. Still, MacDiarmid felt a close affinity to Joyce and compared his own work to Joyce's in a number of articles where he praises his own work under a variety of false names. In Memoriam James Joyce is an anomaly in the long history of literary Celticism, since it is more interested in materialism and science than the spirit, in inverted commas, of the Celtic world. This is a neat reversal of the Arnoldian Celticism of the 19th century, in which it is the Anglo-Saxon world that is associated with rationality, the intellect, science, and materialism. Similarly to Circumjax and Crastus, In Memoriam James Joyce engages with what MacDiarmid calls elsewhere the Celtic genius. Despite its title, the relationship between MacDiarmid's In Memoriam James Joyce and Joyce's own work is fairly tenuous. Indeed, the book's title may have been a late addition when the project was virtually complete and designed partly to, as MacDiarmid put it in a letter, appeal to all Joyce enthusiasts. Furthermore, the text contrasts starkly to the work of the actual writer it is dedicated to. MacDiarmid's poem displays a confidence in the human capacity to understand and classify the world. This stems, I think, partly from McDermott's own interpretation of Finnegan's Wake and of Joyce's work in general, that Joyce's texts are monumental displays of knowledge, which is a misreading in my view. McDermott's language in Memoriam James Joyce is usually confident and direct, with little anxiety that language or text might not possess the capacity to faithfully represent or capture the world or reality. The book aims for, quote, the unity of thing and word, of feeling and its articulation, which is apparently the essence of poetry. In Memoriam James Joyce is the polar opposite of a Joycean lack of faith in knowledge and in the ability of text to contain, match, or express reality. In Memoriam contains a number of declarations of knowledge, understanding, and mastery of academic or arcane subjects. So we have phrases like, we who know, even as we delight in, and even as we know, or even as we know, so we have read, I have known, even as I know. Despite comparing himself to Joyce in a number of articles and dedicating a book to him, McDermott's work is not Joycean in any substantial way. Aside from McDermott's inability to work in a multilingual fashion beyond English and Scots, or his own synthetic Scots, Joyce and McDermott have differing approaches to the relationship between text and reality, or between the word and the world. In Memoriam, James Joyce is part of a small but revealing tradition of Scottish modernist elegies for deceased modern Irishmen. This mini-genre includes In Memoriam James Joyce and two Sorley MacLean texts, Ard Museum de Héireann, so the National Museum of Ireland, and Eguig Yeats at Yeats's grave. So I think there's a minor collection of mid-20th century Scottish poetry dedicated to dead Irishmen, Joyce, Connolly, and to a lesser extent, Yeats. McDermott and MacLean write types of elegies for Joyce and Connolly, respectively, yet the Irishmen remain alive for the Scottish writers. This body of work, in which, to paraphrase McDermott, Scottish modernists look at the shamrock, searches modern Irish history and contemporary Irish culture for examples and exemplars of sacrifice, dedication, and forms of artistic, personal, and political heroism. So to conclude, before the advent of modernism, Scottish literature had a major influence on Ireland and Irish culture via Macpherson's work and the development of literary Celticism, and then through the influence of Walter Scott. There were close personal links during the Irish and Scottish revivals, including the sharp Yeats-Gregory network, but also political differences between the two movements. During the early 20th century, the tide turned, and rather than Scottish literature influencing Irish culture, the energies of Irish politics and culture become a major source of inspiration, if not exactly instruction, for Scottish writers, especially Hugh McDermott. All right, thanks very much.